Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be going through your GCSE Sociology paper 1, the paper that we've written for 2024. So if you haven't had a go at this paper already, what we want you to do is to pause after the question comes up, have a go at it yourself and a bit of paper, and then play the video and watch us work through that answer.
Welcome to this GCSE Sociology AQA 2024 predicted paper, including the sociology of families and education. So you should allow yourself around about 1 hour and 45 minutes to complete all questions on this paper, and there are no options of questions or topics. You must complete all of section A and all of section B. There are 100 marks available within the 1 hour and 45 minutes, which means you can allow yourself roughly 1 minute per mark. There are a variety of questions on this paper, but all should be answered in continuous prose, apart from the multiple choice question where you will just be selecting one answer. On this video walkthrough, we will first of all go through each predicted question, looking at the key skills the examiner is looking for with regards to AO1, AO2 and AO3. And then we will apply this content and these skills to looking at some top band model answers. So let's get going. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe a consensual marriage planned or agreed upon by parents or guardians rather than the couple themselves. Fill one circle only, 1 mark. A forced marriage. B, a same-sex marriage. C, polygamy. Or D, an arranged marriage. So, for these multiple choice questions, it really is just a case of deciding which concept or idea in A, B, C or D is most similar to what is being described in the question. You are literally going to take 1-2 minutes maximum on these short multiple choice questions, but do make sure that you read through all options, as quite often the examiners will slip in 2 ideas that might seem logical and might seem very similar. The 2 ideas we've got here that could seem quite similar and could catch you out are A and D. So A refers to a marriage where either one or both partners are doing so against their will. It has been associated with certain religious movements in the past. You've got B, a same-sex marriage, whereby both partners within the marriage are the same gender. This is becoming much more common in the UK, particularly due to the 2014 Same-Sex Marriage Act. You've got polygamy, which is the act of being married to more than one person at a time or in a relationship with more than one person at a time. With regards to marriage, this is actually illegal within the UK. And then you've got D, an arranged marriage, which for this question is the correct answer, because this is a marriage, again, has been linked to some religions in the past, where both people within that marriage are consensual in terms of they want to get married, and the marriage has been agreed by parents or guardians who have decided that these 2 people are a good match. So we just completely fill the circle for D, and we've got our 1 mark. Do make sure that you only fill 1 circle in the exam. If you fill 2 circles, then you will automatically not get your mark, even if one of your circles is correct. Just quickly with regards to arranged marriages, we certainly have a view in the Western world that these are going to possibly be more likely to end in divorce, because the people who are getting married have not spent that time together beforehand, have not lived together, do not know each other really well. However, globally, there is an average divorce rate that sits in countries like the UK and the USA of between 30 and 40% of couples, and that is astonishingly as low as 4 and 6% when it comes to arranged marriages. So that's quite a nice statistic to think about in the exam. Arranged marriages are some of the most successful marriages that we have examples of. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe a family where both partners are economically active. Fill 1 circle only, 1 mark. A, dual earner family. B, extended family. C, beanpole family. Or D, patriarchal family. Reminder, you are only going to spend 1 to 2 minutes maximum answering this question, You are going to read through all options from A to D, and you are going to only fill one circle. If you fill more than one circle, then your answer for that question will be void and you'll get 0 marks. And we need to remember that quite often the exam board will throw in 2 ideas that could seem very similar and both could seem correct. So make sure you read through your options from A to D really carefully. When it comes to the families topic, it is absolutely vital that you go into the exam knowing the definitions of lots and lots of different family types. So if we start with the bottom, we can see a patriarchal family there for D. That refers to a family type as identified by feminist theorists, and the idea is that certain family structures, like the nuclear family, tend to exploit the female. And that may be because the female is carrying out unpaid domestic chores, is having to look after the children, is potentially even suffering from domestic abuse. For C, we've got beanpole family, and this refers to those long, skinny, multi-generational families with few aunts, few uncles and grandparents. It's a consequence really of an ageing population and a low birth rate. You might find lots of only children within these family types. We've got B, extended family. And this used to be a more common family within the UK. It's becoming less common, but it refers to a family which extends beyond that nuclear family structure. Quite often it involves grandparents living within the family home. And then finally, we've got dual earner family. And this is commonly described as a couple where both spouses are involved in some sort of work outside of the home that they are paid for. So clearly then, A is the correct answer for this question. Both partners are economically active, i.e. we are referring to a dual earner family. And if we wanted to talk about the significance of this family type in other exam questions, we would certainly argue that having both partners being economically active has led to some couples being considered to be more symmetrical or more equal. Describe what sociologists mean by primary socialisation. 3 marks. So you should only be spending around about 3 minutes answering this question. You only need to write a few sentences of description, and there are only marks awarded for A01. So that means you are focusing on knowledge in sociology. And the way that we show the examiner that we have good knowledge is by ensuring that we use theories where appropriate, key terminology and concepts where appropriate. We apply examples and they can be as contemporary as possible. And then in some questions that might also mean we need to use research methods. And to ensure you get your 3 out of 3, the examiner is looking for a full description. So you do make sure that you describe every part of the concept given and you use largely accurate knowledge. So there are not going to be big mistakes within your answer. It is going to be sociologically accurate. And quite often, the concept given will be like the one that you've got in this question here, primary socialisation, where there is absolutely loads you could write about, but you need to select what is succinct and precise. Just to remind you, sociologists refer to 2 very key phases of socialisation in one's life. Primary socialisation takes place during the early childhood years, quite often at home with parents or guardians and siblings. And then secondary socialisation tends to begin once one enters education and then also takes place in other vital institutions such as religion and such as the media. And it is all about the learning of the society or culture that you have been born into's norms, values and culture. And just to remind you, norms are defined as rules or expectations that are socially enforced in society. For example, that might include eating with a knife and fork in a restaurant. Values are linked more towards a standard of what we perceive to be good and successful in society. So we may place a very high value on gaining excellent GCSE results, for example. And culture tends to be linked more towards tradition. So that might include religious practices. So with regards to primary socialisation, let's have a look at a 3 out of 3 answer. Describe what sociologists mean by primary socialisation, 3 marks. Primary socialisation refers to the learning of society's norms, values and culture in the first few years of a child's life before they go to school. It most commonly takes place within the family environment. So you can see very clearly there within the first sentence, we have referred to the real fundamental elements of primary socialisation, which is the learning of norms, values and culture. If this question referred to secondary socialisation, we would start it in exactly the same way, because there we are just referring to institutions that also help us to learn society's norms, values and culture. Here, though, we get the next mark in this answer by referring to that it takes place in the first few years of a child's life. And then we are able to get the full marks for this answer because we support that further by arguing it most commonly takes place within the family environment. So we say what primary socialisation is, we say when it happens, and we say where it happens. And we would follow that exact same structure if it was about secondary socialisation. The only other ideas that we could have included here is maybe some reference to functionalist theory. And that is just because functionalist theory really do argue about the importance of primary socialisation in order to ensure society maintains a value consensus whereby we live in harmony and everyone is in agreement of what is important in society. There's lots of debate in society, particularly amongst the new right, who argue that primary socialisation is no longer being carried out as effectively as it once was, and they primarily put that down to family diversity and the rise of single-parent households. So you can clearly see in just a couple of sentences with succinct use of concepts such as norms, values and culture, and an example of where it takes place and how it takes place, we've got our 3 out of 3. Identify and describe one reason for a rising divorce rate in Britain, 3 marks. So again, just spending around about 3 to 4 minutes maximum writing your answer for this question. And again, we are only applying a couple of sentences in order to get our 3 marks. It's another question where we are only obtaining AO1 marks. So that means the examiners are just expecting you to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of some key concepts, some key terminology, some use of theory, and some examples to support your ideas. And in terms of structuring your answer then, you should straight away identify clearly to the examiner what your reason is. There will always be a few reasons that you can choose on a question like this. You choose the one that you are most confident in describing. And then once you have identified your reason, you will support it with a sentence or 2 of description. So with regards to the divorce rate in Britain then, you should know through your study of families that divorce has been a more common feature of family life in the last 50 years. We're now at a point where we are looking at around about 30% of marriages in the UK ending in divorce. Those statistics do change slightly over time. They have dropped, for example, slightly since 2021. However, they do remain quite consistent for especially young couples or couples that have been married less than 10 years. And there are always going to be common themes that you can use to explain either a rising divorce rate or a drop in the marriage rate in Britain or the UK. And those themes that come up time and time again are secularisation, i.e. the idea that people are now less likely to be religious, and therefore religion promoted the idea of marriage and of couples staying together. So if we no longer believe in religion, we don't necessarily believe in the concept of marriage as much. The changing position of women is an idea or a theme that comes up time and time again. And this means that women are now more likely to work, and therefore they can financially provide for themselves. They have no need to stay in an unhappy marriage as they may have done in the past. Or we can always think about changes in the law. When it comes to divorce, the 1969 Divorce Reform Act is a great example to go into the exam with, because this made divorce much easier and much cheaper for the majority of the population. Let's have a look at a top-band answer. Identify and describe one reason for a rising divorce rate in Britain, 3 marks. One reason to explain a rising divorce rate may be secularization. This means that religion is no longer as important to people in today's world. And this means that people feel less of a stigma if they get divorced, as religion often promotes the idea of staying within a marriage. So you can see there within the first sentence, we very clearly highlight to the examiner that our reason for a rising divorce rate is secularization, i.e. the idea that religion is losing its impact and significance in Britain. And you could highlight that that refers specifically to Christianity, which is the dominant religion in the UK. However, there has been a decline in the number of people attending church, which is now at only around about 6 or 7% of the population per week, and therefore people are less likely to believe the ideas that that religion promotes. So that gives us our 1 mark out of 3 straight away. What we then do is add more knowledge in order to get our 3 out of 3. That little phrase, "this means that," is a great one to include in lots of these shorter questions, because it just highlights to the examiner that you are adding now your description. And here we have described what secularization means and the idea that religion is no longer important to people today, which then we describe means that people feel less of a stigma. Just to remind you, stigma refers to the idea that there are negative connotations associated with an act. So in the past, for example, there would have been quite negative opinions on someone obtaining a divorce, perhaps because of messages given to people within the Bible. But now, if people don't read the Bible anymore and they're not as bothered by it, they're not going to feel quite so stigmatized if they end up getting divorced. And again, that word stigma is one that you can use in lots of different essay questions or short answer questions in AQA sociology with regards to changing family patterns, lower marriage rates or lower birth rates. Item A. Young and Wilmot carried out research focusing on the changing roles performed by men and women in the nuclear family. Through carrying out face-to-face structured interviews in East London with almost 200 participants, they concluded that the family was becoming more symmetrical. They ensured they were also able to achieve a large sample by putting time limits on their interviews. Source: Wilmot and Young, The Symmetrical Family, 1974. From item A, examine one strength of the research, 2 marks. So within this question, you have got a research study that you should be familiar with because Young and Wilmot carried out that very significant research regarding symmetrical families and the idea that couples are becoming more equal. You could get a study like this that you are familiar with in the exam and is one of your key studies, or you could equally get some research that you are not familiar with, more likely to be in the form of official statistics or data. And here you are being awarded 2 AO3 marks because you should be showing your evaluation skills, i.e. providing a strength or, in some questions, a disadvantage of the research. So you will be awarded 1 mark if you are able to effectively use the item and from that item obtain a strength of the research. So this will be in the detail given to you regarding how the research was completed. And then you will be awarded 1 mark for providing an accurate reason as to why this is considered a strength of the research. And quite often, this will be a more general research methods answer. So you'll be thinking about key terms such as validity, reliability, and representativeness. You don't really need to apply much knowledge of families and households within these types of questions in the exam. You are really being assessed here more on your ability to be able to apply your knowledge of research methods. So if we just have a look at the item, there are a few different ideas we could have pulled out of this with regards to strengths. First of all, the fact that the research was conducted face-to-face. That means that the researcher has more of an opportunity to build up a rapport with the sample or the participants rather than just completing something like a questionnaire on your own. 200 participants were used within the research, which is actually quite a large sample and therefore may mean it is more likely to be representative. And then in that last sentence, it says that time limits were put on the interviews. So that may mean that the interviewer was able to stay more focused on the specific questions and also the researchers were not given quite so much of an opportunity to go off on a tangent. This links back to the idea that the interviews are structured, and therefore it is likely that the data obtained is going to be more standardised across participants. Let's have a look at a 2 out of 2 answer. From item A, examine one strength of the research, 2 marks. One strength would be the fact that they carried out structured interviews. This means the interviews would have been completed in a standardised way and the data obtained would therefore be comparable. So we have gone here for structured interviews as a major strength of the research, obviously associated with positivist research methods in sociology and the view that sociology should be studied scientifically. And it basically means that unlike unstructured interviews, the interviewer has to stay within a line of very strict questioning, does not probe the respondent, and therefore, as explained in that second sentence, the data obtained is going to be comparable because you should have some consistent types of answers given to you in this standardized interview format. You can also see from the structure of this answer that in the first sentence we get 1 out of 2 marks by identifying from the item the advantage, which is structured interviews as the format. And then you can also see that second mark is obtained with an extra piece of information, an extra sentence regarding why structured interviews are positive. And if the question had been examining a disadvantage of the research, we could have still used structured interviews as a disadvantage, but this time we'd have been arguing from an interpretivist perspective and said that the structured interview would not have allowed the respondent to explain their answers in a deep and meaningful way. So if you go into the exam confident on the differences between positivism and interpretivism, or in fact quantitative versus qualitative methods, you can always flip your answers around when it comes to it regarding strengths or weaknesses. Item A. Young and Wilmot carried out research focusing on the changing roles performed by men and women in the nuclear family. Through carrying out face-to-face structured interviews in East London with almost 200 participants, they concluded that the family was becoming more symmetrical. They ensured they were able to achieve a large sample by putting time limits on their interviews. Source: Wilmot and Young, The Symmetrical Family, 1974. Identify and explain one factor that may have led to an increase in the symmetrical families referred to in item A, 4 marks. So you are going to allow around about 4 to 5 minutes maximum to complete your answer. And you are able to achieve 1 AO1 mark for the suitable factor that you identify, and a further 3 AO2 marks. That means good explanation of why this is a factor, applying sociological theories, concepts, examples, research methods where appropriate, to gain up to 3 marks. And quite often in these questions, there will be a variety of factors that you can use within your answer. You just need to make sure you select the factor that you are then able to explain in some detail. And the term factor is one that you will see in lots of AQA GCSE sociology questions. And it basically refers to something that occurs in society that affects human behaviour. So examples of sociological factors could be education, could be the law, could be changes in culture. And with regards to the symmetrical family, we are referring to that key study by Young and Wilmot in the 1970s that concluded that a symmetrical family is one where the roles and responsibilities outside and inside the home are shared more equally. And within the nuclear families that Young and Wilmot studied, that included both partners taking on jobs outside of the home potentially, or both participating in domestic labour or childcare within the home, which was obviously very different from those nuclear families that they had researched in the 1950s, who tended to take a more segregated conjugal role approach to their relationship, i.e. males took the breadwinner role and females took the caregiver role. So within this question, we are trying to understand a reason that has led to families moving from those traditional nuclear hierarchical structures to a more equal and identical family structure between the male and female in the relationship. And there are themes such as the changing position of women that come up time and time again in these questions, as both feminism and changes within the law led to women being less dependent on men as the breadwinner and could go out and earn their own wage, leading to families being more symmetrical. Also, family diversity is one of those topics you can always come back to when a question is asking you about new family structures. And here we are just basically arguing that due to changes in wider society, such as secularisation and a declining stigma attached to diverse family types, there has been a breakdown in the dominance of traditional nuclear families where men and women perform separate roles. There is now much more of a pick and mix or postmodern approach to family life, whereby couples can decide what roles they would like to play within a family unit. Let's have a look at what a model answer might look like. Identify and explain one factor that may have led to an increase in the symmetrical families referred to in item A. 4 marks. One factor that may have led to an increase in the symmetrical family referred to in the item is the changing role of women in society due to changes within the law. This includes the Equal Pay Act and Sexual Discrimination Act, which meant women were legally entitled to earn the same wages as men at work. This therefore led to more dual earner households, whereby men and women both work, and in turn Young and Wilmot found that this made couples more equal, with men also completing domestic chores and helping with childcare. So note in the very first sentence we make it clear to the examiner what factor we are arguing has led to an increase in symmetrical families, which here we are going for the changing role of women in society. But we have also linked that actually to another factor. These two go hand in any question. The changing role of women could not have happened without changes made within the law. So arguing from a liberal feminist perspective here, the Equal Pay Act of 1970 and the Sexual Discrimination Act of 1975 just make it much more worthwhile for women to go out and work, because when they're in the workforce now, it is illegal for them to be discriminated against because of their gender. Examples of that might include a woman being paid less than a man, even if they are carrying out the same roles, or a woman being sacked from her job as a consequence of being pregnant. Just also note the use of some short little phrases here that help to show the examiner that we are applying AO2. The first one is "this includes the," which just shows the examiner that we are applying an example effectively. And then following on from that, we explain the significance of that example through the phrase "this therefore led to." And both of those are a fantastic way to structure your 4 marker, because you clearly identify your factor, support that with an example, and then analyse the significance of that. And another top tip, if you do get into the exam and there is a concept such as a family type mentioned in the question that you do not know the meaning of or can't remember, reread item A. There will be lots of hints within that item as to what that family type is. And then quite often there are very similar factors or reasons that you will apply in a number of sociological 4 markers, such as changes in the law, changes in religion, changes in the position of women. And finally, like at the end of this answer, if you can refer back to the study, Young and Wilmot is obviously one of your key studies, so you will go into the exam knowing the ins and outs of what Young and Wilmot discovered, then that is a really good idea to get it in somewhere. Identify and explain one disadvantage of using self-completion questionnaires to investigate the changing relationship between parents and children in families. 4 marks. Spending around about 4 minutes to 5 minutes maximum on this question in the exam. And again, you will be able to achieve a maximum of 1 mark for AO1, and that means you identify your disadvantage of self-completion questionnaires, And then you can achieve a further 3 marks of AO2, i.e. analysis and application of sociology. And in this question, this is made up of you explaining that disadvantage, but then also trying to put that into the context specifically of trying to investigate the changing relationship between parents and children in families. And that idea of context is so important on these 4-mark questions, whereby you are given a research method. Wherever possible, refer to the specific context that the examiners have given you. The context will always be something taken from the family's topic that you have already studied. If you are not able to mention the specific context in your answer, it is still worth providing a disadvantage and providing some explanation, and you should be able to achieve 2 marks out of 4 for that. If you are able to apply a disadvantage, explain that disadvantage, and partly put it into context, then you should achieve 3 out of 4. And those answers that provide the disadvantage, explain the disadvantage, and give a relevant and good discussion of applying this to the context given will be able to achieve 4 out of 4. So when approaching these types of questions, I would always advise students to first of all think of your disadvantage. So self-completion questionnaires, we know, are linked to positivism. They provide quantitative data. And the idea is that the respondent is handed the questionnaire, has very limited contact then with the researcher, and completes the answers to that questionnaire on their own, at their own pace. Disadvantages of that then are most commonly the response rate. As soon as a sociological researcher hands the power to the respondent and walks away, it is very likely that that respondent will not complete the questionnaire. Or if they do complete the questionnaire, they may be a very specific type of respondent. For example, the elderly are much more likely to complete self-completion questionnaires, and therefore your sample will not be representative. Other ideas with regards to disadvantages in general of self-completion questionnaires, we may argue that they lack validity, i.e. they don't give us a true insight in what we are trying to measure. It is very easy for people to lie on self-completion questionnaires. It is likely that they have gained any sense of rapport with the researcher who is very detached from the method. It can be very difficult gaining access to participants for these self-completion questionnaires as well. Where do you actually find your sample of people who are willing to complete this on their own? And once you have decided which disadvantage you are going for, you add that little bit of explanation that we have just been discussing and apply it to the context. Students often find applying these ideas to the context really tricky, but it does not need to be. There are themes that come up time and time again in families when it comes to research methods. For example, lots of the topics that we study in families are very personal, and that is just due to the nature of families being quite a private matter for people. Therefore, on a lot of these research method questions, you can go with quite a standard answer, but actually, unless the research method really does involve the respondent and the researcher building up a huge amount of rapport through something like an unstructured interview, then actually it's going to feel quite cold and detached completing a method like a self-completion questionnaire about such a personal topic to someone. It might also mean that regardless of the research method, the question of families is so personal and so emotive that you are going to find it very difficult to obtain a sample that are willing to take part in the research. Again, the personal nature of families might mean that lots of research methods become unethical. It might open up wounds within a family to discuss some of the elements, such as the one we've got in front of us here, the changing relationship between parents and children. Think for a moment about parents and children who have quite negative relationships. Think about a parent that might not have contact with their child. Certainly, completing any sort of research for that parent or that child is going to be very distressing. And then finally, any research method you get in the exam that is quantitative, you can argue may not actually address the complex nature of families, and therefore the data obtained is going to lack deep meaning. So let's have a look at a top-band answer. One disadvantage is that the respondents may not understand all of the questions that they are being asked due to the questionnaire being completed by the respondent themselves. This may be especially true if children are completing the questionnaire on their own to consider the relationship between them and their parents, and therefore lead to some answers given not being valid. This means the research will not really show a true reflection of changing relationships. So you can see in this answer, straight away we highlight our disadvantage is the fact that because the questionnaire is self-completion, the respondents are not able to ask any questions and they might not understand all of the questions that they are being asked. We use a lot of specific language within sociology, a lot of concepts, and if you start putting those words within your questionnaires, you are going to find a lot of respondents do not understand what you are asking. And here we then put this in context by saying that this is especially a difficult problem if you are expecting children to complete your questionnaire. Children are likely to have a lower reading age than adults. They are likely to understand less sociological concepts than adults, and they just also have less life experience than adults. So they may feel pressured to complete this questionnaire and just start ticking boxes left, right and centre, not really understanding what they are agreeing or disagreeing to. Here we argue that this means the answers will not be valid, i.e. they will not give us a true insight into changing relationships between parent and children. Item B. Writing in 1982, the rapporteurs wrote extensively about the ways family life in Britain was now characterised by diversity. They argued that the idea of a traditional nuclear family being dominant was now outdated, and that individuals often now experience several different family types over their lifetime. The main focus of their ideas was around family life being diverse in 5 different ways, including organisational, cultural, cohort, life course and social class. Source: Rappaport and Rappaport, British Families in Transition, 1982. From item B, identify and describe one way in which the rapporteurs view family life as becoming increasingly diverse, including what you know of their perspective on the family. 4 marks. Once again, spending only around about 4 to 5 minutes answering this question, and that includes time to read item B. And in terms of how your marks are achieved on this question, you will be awarded 1 mark for your AO1, i.e. the way that you identify something within the item and that the rapporteurs view as family life becoming increasingly diverse. And then a further 3 marks for your AO2, i.e. your sociological knowledge, concepts, examples and ideas related to the way that you have identified family life as becoming increasingly diverse. And within those 3 AO2 marks, the examiners are looking for a well-developed discussion relating this to the key study that you have been given, which within this question is all about the rapporteurs and their groundbreaking study into how family life in the UK is now characterised by diversity, i.e. there are lots of different types of families, and even within families there are lots of different types of people, which really goes against that outdated, old-fashioned view of sociologists like functionalists who argue that it is the nuclear family that are dominant in society and that keep society harmonious. So regardless of whether you get a specific question on this key study in the exam, the rapporteurs are a fantastic example to use if you are ever writing about family life in the UK becoming more diverse. And also that being a really fantastic thing. Within this specific question, item B gives you the different ways that the rapporteurs argue family life is becoming more diverse. They are organisational, and this idea that the roles within the family may have changed. Cultural, and the idea that the ethnicity of a family may change that family structure. Cohort, thinking about how family life changes from one generation to the next. Life course, and this popular idea that actually within modern society, we may in our lives go through several different family structures. And finally, social class and the idea that actually the way we experience family will be different depending on the social class we are from, such as the opportunities we have available to us. So your job is really just to explain these ideas in more detail with what you know about their study. Other studies that you may get in a similar question in the exam that you need to know in detail include Delphi and Leonard, Oakley, Parsons, Wilmot and Young, and Zaretsky. Let's have a look what a 4 out of 4 answer looks like. From item B, identify and describe one way in which the Rappaports view family life as becoming increasingly diverse, including what you know of their perspective on the family. 4 marks. As shown in item B, the Rappaports view the nuclear family as now being an outdated family structure, and that instead modern families in the UK are characterised by diversity. Their study identified that there are now 5 types of family diversity commonly found, including class, culture, organisational, life course and cohort. For example, they found that within life course diversity, people are now much more likely to live in a variety of family households and structures throughout their life, from nuclear to one parent and reconstituted. So you can see within this answer straight away, we show the examiner that we understand the key thing that the Rappaports believe about family life is that the nuclear family is outdated and modern families are characterised by diversity. Diversity is a term that appears a lot within this families topic, and it basically refers to a different type of family structure to the norm. So that may include one-parent families, reconstituted families, extended families, polyamorous families. What we then do is take more information from the item, i.e. the 5 different ways that family diversity may occur, but we include what we know of their perspective on the family by taking one of those and explaining it in more detail. We use the example of life course diversity here and argue that this means that one person may now go through several different types of families just throughout their own lifetime. I could have also included some more context on this key study by the Rappaports and the idea that in 1982 they really were ahead of their time because certain types of relationships, such as homosexual relationships and family structures, were still more stigmatised by the 1980s. And right-wing sociologists, such as the New Right, were dominating social policy on families and households in this time period, advocating for nuclear families. And therefore, the fact that the Rappaports acknowledge the importance and significance of family diversity is really paving the way for other sociologies, such as postmodernists. Identify and explain one ethical issue that you would need to consider when investigating cohabitation in Britain today. 4 marks. So we need to spend around about 4 to 5 minutes maximum completing our answer to this question. And you can obtain a maximum of 1 AO1 mark for identifying your ethical issue, and then 3 marks for AO2, i.e. how you are able to explain that ethical issue using key terminology, examples, and also applying this to the context that you have been given within families, which in this question is cohabitation. Just to remind you, when it comes to research methods, you could have to consider practical issues, i.e. that refers to the difficulties that a sociologist may encounter in actually trying to complete the research, maybe how expensive it is, maybe how time-consuming it is. You could be asked to consider ethical issues, like you are in this question, and this refers to whether the research could cause any discomfort or harm to either the researcher or the respondents. And then finally, you could have to consider theoretical issues, which is linked to quantitative versus qualitative methods or positivist versus interpretivism. and really what you are looking for within your research. Are you more bothered about reliability, or are you all about the validity of a study? Once you have identified in this question your ethical issue, you then need to add a sentence explaining why that is an issue, and then a further sentence trying to put that into the context of cohabitation. Just to remind you of the types of ethical issues that you can consider within sociological research, it may be about confidentiality, i.e., are you going to ensure that any research and data collected stays private and does not fall into the hands of someone not associated with the research? Anonymity, i.e., ensuring that respondents cannot be identified through your research unless specifically told otherwise. Sensitivity, which is one that can come up quite often within families because it's all about whether your research crosses a line in terms of how emotionally it may impact your respondent. Or consent. Does everyone in your study understand what research is being collected, why it is being collected, and how it is being collected? That one quite often linked to the idea of covert versus overt observations. Covert being closed and deceitful, overt being out in the open and everyone aware of what's going on. So once we've identified an ethical issue, we then need to try and explain that in the context of cohabitation. And just to remind you, cohabitation is a family structure that is increasing in modern Britain today and refers to when a couple may live together under the same roof, but they are not married. So they are monogamous, they may have children, and they may have been in relationship with each other for many, many years, but they may be actively choosing to not get married, or they may just be delaying marriage. And with regards to official statistics on this, the proportion of people who live in a couple that are cohabiting has increased across all age groups and now stands at 24% of the population. So with all that in mind, let's have a look at a top-band answer. Identify and explain one ethical issue that you would need to consider when investigating cohabitation in Britain today. 4 marks. One ethical consideration when investigating cohabitation would be ensuring respondents were fully aware from the outset that they have the right to withdraw from the research completely at any point. This is because cohabitation is a highly personal topic to research for many people, as it includes personal relationships, and if a respondent felt some of the investigation was becoming too personal or sensitive, they should be able to leave at any time without being harmed in any way. So within this answer, we go straight to the ethical consideration in the context from the beginning, i.e. the right to withdraw. And it is recommended in all sociological research that it is made exceptionally clear to every single participant that they are welcome to leave or remove themselves from a research project at any part in the study. And this could be an ethical consideration that we would need to have regardless of the family's topic that we are studying. So it's a really nice, easy one to remember for a variety of different contexts. Here we relate that well to cohabitation by arguing that cohabitation is by its very definition a personal relationship between two people. And therefore, if halfway through the research, the questions become too personal, for example, maybe the person who is cohabiting would like to be married, and therefore some of the questions about why they are choosing to cohabit rather than being in a married relationship could be quite triggering for that person. They can leave the research at any point. We could have used examples such as ensuring that the data remains anonymous. So cohabitation is still quite a contentious issue for some people within society, particularly within religious organisations such as the Church of England, who tend to promote the idea of no sex before marriage. And therefore, it may be that participants don't want to reveal that they are living in a cohabiting household and should be able to remain anonymous throughout all of the research. Finally, whenever ethics is mentioned in a question, you can always refer back to new GDPR laws. So this is general data protection regulation that was introduced by the government in 2018. So shows the examiner as well that you have great contemporary knowledge about research methods, and means that whenever sociological research is conducted, it is the responsibility of the researcher to ensure that this data remains confidential and is stored correctly. This may be particularly important with regards to cohabitation, because it is likely that within that study you will have private and confidential information about your participants, such as their names, their ages, and where they live. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that families in Britain today are patriarchal, 12 marks. So this is one of the highest tariff questions that you will answer on your AQA GCSE sociology papers. And you will be required to answer 2 for families and household, 2 for education, and the same for paper 2 with regards to crime and stratification. So it is really vital that you get the hang of how AQA are expecting you to attempt this question and structure your answer. There is no choice when it comes to these essays, so you do just have to go with the ones that you are given. However, there will always be lots of arguments and lots of explanation that you can apply to this question. It really is a case of you picking and choosing the content that you are most confident with. And if we start with what the examiners are looking for, on these 12 markers, you can achieve 4 marks for AO1, 4 marks for AO2, and 4 marks for AO3. So that means you will be awarded equally for your knowledge, your application of this knowledge, and your evaluation. So we need to see all 3 of those things done really well. With regards to structure on these 12 markers, I would always recommend starting with a very short introduction, whereby you define key concepts in the question, and also a very brief outline of the 2 sides of the argument that you will be discussing. I would then recommend completing a very chunky PhET paragraph on one side of the argument. PhET refers to point, evidence, explain, link, and evaluation. And then providing a lovely chunky PhET paragraph on the other side of the argument. Point, evidence, explain, link, evaluation. And then finally, a short conclusion at the bottom where you do go back to that question and try to answer it as fully as you can. Some students will be more confident writing 2 shorter paragraphs for your side agreeing with the question and 2 shorter paragraphs for the side disagreeing with the question. That is equally absolutely fine to do. Just make sure whichever way you attempt it, you include evaluation in every single one of your points. So you do not just create juxtaposition evaluation. That means going from one argument to another. You need to make sure that you provide specific criticism for each of the points that you make if you want to get into that top band. And quite often on these 12 markers, you will need to apply sociological theory. So that includes functionalism, Marxism, and feminism. You may, in some questions, even want to bring in ideas from the New Right. Less likely that you will be using research methods within this question, but if it is appropriate, that is absolutely fine to also include. And do just make sure that you apply contemporary examples throughout your answer. And this is where it is really important as a sociology student to make sure that you are watching the news, you are reading newspapers as often as possible. What examiners really do not want students to do on these 12 markers is to just start giving their opinion on what is probably quite a contentious issue within the question. So even if you do get into the exam paper and have lots of personal opinions on the question in front of you, this one is regarding society being patriarchal, please do try and keep your answer as sociological as possible. Focus on the theory and the studies that you have learned, not just on your individual attitude to the question that you've been given. And to get into the top band, the 10 to 12 mark level descriptors for these questions, it really is about making sure that you hit all the criteria with regards to AO1, AO2 and AO3. So that means for AO1, your knowledge will be excellent. You will show this through your use of theories and concepts. It means for AO2, you will be able to expertly apply this theory, this terminology, and provide examples to support that. And it means that in your AO3, your criticism will be clear and there will be a line of argument or debate created. And finally, before we have a look at a top band answer, the other thing that students sometimes fail to do on these questions is to stay focused on the question. It is very easy within sociology to start applying studies that you are confident about, but you need to make sure that you focus on the key concept or phrase within the question that is going to help you develop a clear line of argument. Here, that line of argument is all about Britain being patriarchal. So the fact that that word is used within the question is your little hint that you need to be applying feminist theory. You should know going into the exam that patriarchal refers to society being dominated by men, there being this unfair hierarchy that keeps women exploited and oppressed. And therefore, this mini essay that you construct is going to be all about whether feminism has still got relevance in today's society when we consider the context of families. Students quite often ask whether you can bring in knowledge from other topics within these 12 markers. And whilst it is never a bad idea in sociology to think synoptically, that means across topics, you do really need to make sure that you only do that on these 12-mark questions if the knowledge is explicitly relevant. So, for example, if you've learnt something on the stratification side of the course regarding the gender pay gap, that might help you in this question if you are considering that men are more likely to go out and work and women are more likely to take on the expressive role within the family. With that in mind, let's have a look at a top band answer. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that families in Britain today are patriarchal, 12 marks. Feminists argue that families remain patriarchal in the UK. However, other theories take a march of progress view, arguing that family life is becoming more equal for men and women. So you can see in the introduction there, we just showed the examiner what our 2 lines of argument will be within this essay. Feminists on the one hand who agree with the statement, and then we introduce this idea of march of progress sociologists who, if you remember, argue that over time, society is always becoming fairer and more equal, who obviously disagree with the statement. I would not encourage you to write any more than that for your introduction because it is quite hard to pick up marks here. The examiner is excited and looking forward to reading your chunky paragraphs. Radical feminists believe that the family is a patriarchal institution and are therefore highly critical of the nuclear family structure. They argue that these types of families, whereby the male often takes a breadwinner role, leads to the exploitation of women. For example, Dalphy and Leonard studied housework within families and concluded that even within families where women work full-time, women normally take on an unpaid role of a cleaner, cook and shopper for the family. This therefore benefits the male in the family, reflecting and reinforcing the patriarchy found within wider society. This is further supported by Oakley, who argued that girls learn their submissive role in a patriarchal family through primary socialisation, whereby they are handed specific toys to reinforce gender stereotypes. However, functionalists such as Parsons criticise this view and argue these gender stereotypes are based on biological differences, not patriarchal norms. So you can see in this answer, straight away we identify the types of sociologists who would agree with the statement. And here we are referring to radical feminists. I would really always encourage students to identify specifically the type of feminist that you are referring to in your answer, just because there are such stark differences between the views of liberal feminists and radical feminists who take a much more extreme approach to ideas about patriarchy in society. We also specifically mention the family structure that we are referring to in that sentence, i.e. the nuclear family. So we want to make sure to the examiner that we are clear that radical feminists aren't necessarily criticising every type of family in society. They are highly critical of the nuclear family. And once we've achieved our AO1 mark by identifying the type of sociologists who agree with the statement, we then obtain our AO2 marks through that little phrase, they argue that. because we are showing the examiner we have knowledge of radical feminists and we are applying that to this question. We also support that with an example, one of your key studies, Delphi and Leonard, who really do take one of the most critical views when it comes to studying the family and women's oppression within the family. And if you note, what this paragraph also does really well is it does not just stop there with regards to knowledge. We support that by Oakley. And again, it is worth considering that little phrase, this is further supported by, as a way to show the examiner that we are applying further analysis. This is the point at which some sociology students might feel more comfortable putting that into a second paragraph, which is absolutely fine. I just think it reads better if you form one nice, neat paragraph. And here we are considering the work of Anne Oakley, who, just like Delphi and Leonard, is highly critical of the nuclear family structure. She argues slightly differently that the unequal relationships between girls and boys or husbands and wives starts from the moment that little girl is handed a toy kitchen or iron, which just then reinforces gender stereotypes that girl will experience throughout the whole of her life. So for Oakley, if we want to understand why families in Britain today are still patriarchal, we need to go back to consider primary socialisation. So there is absolutely loads of lovely AO2 within that answer. We have examples of 2 different sociologists, and we have practical examples of how that relates to the family and how that supports the idea that the family is patriarchal. What we need to do now is achieve our AO3 on that specific paragraph. And here we create debate by using Parsons. So Parsons takes a functionalist perspective and is highly critical of the idea that families are patriarchal, or that this is a bad thing, because in Parsons' view, all of these differences between males and females within families are not based on patriarchal values, they are based on biological differences, i.e. men and women are born differently, and men and women are good at completing their separate or segregated roles. Other criticism that we can always apply in a theory question like this, if you get a traditional theory such as functionalism, feminism or Marxism, is that we fail to recognise the diversity of family life now in the UK, i.e. it's a little outdated of these studies to still only consider the role of the nuclear family, where we now live in a society where there are lots of different family types, such as single parent families, extended families or reconstituted families. So we are now going to create further debate by discussing those sociologists who do not agree with our question that families in Britain today are patriarchal. Furthermore, Young and Wilmot discovered that within their study of nuclear families in East London, that families were becoming more equal and what they defined as symmetrical. This means that both men and women within the family were taking a more balanced share of domestic chores, childcare, and spending their leisure time together, which means that families are not patriarchal. This may be due to the changing position of women, who are now just as likely to work as men creating dual-earner families. However, Scott and Clary critique this view and argue that in most families, women still perform the majority of household chores, despite working, which leads to a double shift. So this second paragraph provides that debate on the other side of the argument, and here we are discussing the March of Progress sociologist we have mentioned in our introduction, that is Young and Wilmot. Another of your key studies within families and households. And in their study of East End families in 1973, Young and Wilmot used social surveys to discover that families had become more symmetrical, i.e. men and women were now taking on similar roles within the family as opposed to the segregated gender roles of the past. So it might be that whilst men and women are not doing the exact same type of jobs, men are now taking on more of a share of domestic labour, helping to look after the children, and also men and women are choosing to spend their leisure time together. So this is a really groundbreaking and fantastic study to use in any question where you need to argue that couples are becoming more equal in modern society, or, as is the case in this question, families are becoming less patriarchal. And we also link their study to one of the key factors that comes up time and time again in this course, which is the changing position of women. You really need to go into the exam understanding what sociologists mean by the changing position of women, which basically refers to feminism and more female rights in society. So one example of that would be women being just as likely to earn now as men, and that has been a consequence of the Equal Pay Act of 1970 and the Sexual Discrimination Act of 1975, both of which making it more worthwhile for women to go to work. And then we critique this point with some other sociologists to create debate. So Scott and Clary argue that actually women are still performing the majority of household chores even when they are working, and therefore there's this term of a double shift. This view has also been put forward by many other sociologists, such as Arlie Hochschild, who examined the roles between men and women within relationships. And it basically means that women's lives are not getting better over time, they're actually getting worse. Because now women are going out to work, in many cases full time, and once they come home, they are still taking on that expressive role of doing the majority of the housework, the childcare, the cooking and the cleaning. We could have also evaluated Young and Wilmot's study specifically. So the fact that they only focused on nuclear families in East London means it is not a representative sample of the whole country potentially, but also of different family types. Or we could have also referred to their study being slightly outdated, as it focuses only on one family type, the nuclear family, and doesn't take into account the multiple different families we have now as part of postmodern society. Let's just look quickly now at our short conclusion. In conclusion, women becoming economically active has led to relationships within families becoming less patriarchal. However, they are still not completely equal. So here we just basically argue that yes, there have been major shifts within families in Britain today that do seem to suggest that families are less patriarchal. However, it doesn't mean that women's lives are necessarily getting better or that women have achieved full equality. And radical feminists would certainly continue to argue that until women separate themselves completely from men within relationships, there will always be patriarchy in families. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that marriage is no longer seen as important in British family life. 12 marks. So you are going to want to spend between around 12 to 15 minutes answering this question, and you should be structuring your answer as a short sociological essay. So that means start with an introduction where you lay out your argument. Then you need to ensure that you have two sides of a debate. In this question, that is one side of a debate arguing that marriage is no longer important in British family life, and another side of the debate that argues that marriage is still important in British family life. I always like to go down the route of doing two chunky, peely paragraphs where you may use more than one sociologist per paragraph to create some really nice analysis. However, if you find that quite tricky, you can apply two ideas on either side of the argument. You just need to make sure to get into the top band that you are showing evaluation of your specific points. You need to avoid juxtaposition evaluation where you just flip from one idea to the next. And then for your conclusion, you will generally summarise both viewpoints that you have put forward and try to reach some sort of decision about which one is more applicable to British family life today. And you can achieve 4 marks for AO1, so that is showing excellent knowledge and explanation of theories, concepts, examples. 4 marks for AO2, that is your ability to apply these theories and terminology to the specific question. Here we've got whether marriage is no longer seen as important for British family life. And then a maximum of 4 marks for your criticism, so your evaluation of such theory, key examples or terminology. And it is very important on these 12 markers to make sure that you do stick to sociological arguments. One of the best ways to do that is to make sure that you have either a specific theory, such as functionalism, Marxism or feminism in each of your paragraphs, or you have specific sociologists mentioned. If you don't or you're not able to do that, you sometimes can end up just providing general arguments that come from your own opinions that are not backed by evidence. And to get into that top band, you do need to make sure that all of your arguments are evidence-based. With regards to this specific question then, we are trying to find evidence to suggest that marriage is no longer important in British family life. There are a couple of different routes that you could go down. You could focus specifically on marriage rates that are dropping and have been dropping consistently over the last 20 years in the UK. Or you could focus on the rise of divorce or the rise of cohabitation. Because through divorce increasing or cohabitation increasing, that is people living together and choosing not to get married, we could argue that marriage as an institution is no longer therefore as significant to people. And there have been some really interesting recent statistics with regards to marriage in the UK. So in 2021, the ONS, or the Office for National Statistics, reported that for the first time, the proportion of people aged 16 or older in England who are married or in a civil partnership had fallen below 50%, 49.7% in 2021, and then that has dropped further to 49.4% in 2022. So we certainly have the data to suggest that the inquiry question here regarding marriage may be correct. And moving away from statistical data regarding the marriage rates within the UK, you might also want to consider theoretical knowledge within this essay. And clearly it is functionalism and the new right who would be the theorists arguing that marriage should remain a very significant institution within the UK. Both of these theories view marriage as the way for children to be correctly socialised, that learning of norms, values and culture, and are highly critical of the rise in cohabitation, which has also doubled over the last 20 years. And a top tip would be any question that you get in the families paper that asks you about marriage or divorce or cohabitation, there are some very similar themes that you can often bring into your analysis. That is the changing position of women, to the fact that women now no longer rely on men to be a breadwinner. They can earn for themselves economically and don't feel as pressured to get married. That might also be secularisation, i.e. the decline in the significance of religion in society, which so often promotes values of monogamous nuclear relationships. And finally, family diversity. So the idea that in modern society there is less of a stigma attached to a variety of different households, such as single parent families or reconstituted families. With that in mind, let's have a look at a top band answer. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that marriage is no longer seen as important in British family life, 12 marks. There has been a consistent drop in marriage rates over the last 40 years, which could suggest marriage is no longer seen as important and is instead being replaced by cohabitation. So within that introduction, we make clear to the examiner that we understand the trend with regards to marriage, i.e. marriage rates have been consistently dropping. And we also hint within that very short introduction at where our line of argument will be. Here we are going for the idea that marriage is being replaced by cohabitation, the idea that people are choosing not to marry and instead are living in long-term relationships together. No need to add any more to your introduction there. Much better off to just get straight into those lovely, chunky, peely paragraphs, point, evidence, explain, link, evaluation. Let's go. There has been a significant drop in the number of marriages and rise in the number of divorces since the 1970s, which could suggest that marriage is no longer seen as important in British family life. This may be due to changes in the lawmaking, such as the 1969 Divorce Act, that made divorce easier and cheaper to obtain, or due to the changing position of women, who are now financially able to support themselves and therefore no longer rely on a male breadwinner within a married nuclear family structure. Furthermore, the proportion of people cohabiting has doubled over the last 20 years, and people may be choosing this as an alternative to getting married. However, there has been an increase in other types of marriages, such as same-sex and civil partnerships, suggesting it is still important to British family life. So first of all, in this paragraph, you can see two very common factors that come up all the time in sociology, one of those being the changes in laws. I would recommend using the 1969 Divorce Act as a piece of evidence in an exam question about drops in marriage rates or increasing divorce rates, and that is just because this Divorce Act was absolutely essential in extending the circumstances in which one could obtain a divorce. It really was considered quite a revolutionary piece of legislation with regards to divorce because it meant that a no-fault divorce could be requested, which basically just means if you don't get on with your partner anymore, if you don't want to be married to them anymore, that's okay. You can leave each other quite quickly and without costing people thousands and thousands of pounds. Then within this same paragraph, we apply more analysis by adding on the example of cohabitation. Some sociology students like to separate those ideas within a 12 marker, which is absolutely fine. I do just think where possible, if you can apply it within one paragraph to create more of an essay type answer, it does look a bit more sophisticated. And here we apply some key evidence, i.e. the number of people cohabiting has doubled over the last 20 years. A really nice, easy statistic to remember for the exam. And here we are arguing that people are therefore actively choosing cohabitation as an alternative to getting married, which clearly supports our inquiry question, i.e. marriage is not as important to people in Britain anymore. We do then just support that with a piece of specific evidence again with regards to our criticism. Remember, you do need to try and provide evaluation for each of your points to make sure that you're avoiding juxtaposition evaluation. And here we argue that actually maybe the decline of heterosexual marriages does not signify that marriage is not important for anyone in society anymore, because actually same-sex marriages, particularly since 2014, when the Same-Sex Marriage Act was introduced, have been increasing. We could also have applied a sociologist called Chester here, who argues that whilst couples are choosing to cohabit now in much larger numbers, it actually does not mean that there has been a decline in the importance of marriage. Chester argues that for most cohabiting couples, they will eventually go on to get married. They are just delaying it slightly to ensure that they are with someone that they want to be with forever. Let's read on. Sociologists may also argue that marriage is still important in family life, and changes in marriage rates simply reflect wider family diversity, not the fact marriage is less important. For example, there is now a wider acceptance in modern society of a variety of different family types, such as lone parent families or reconstituted families, and therefore marriage is not necessarily less important. There is just more choice available, and people may put off marriage until later. However, functionalists may argue that the rise of family diversity is negative, as it has undermined the importance of marriage in society, which they see as fundamental in providing adequate primary socialisation. So if you are ever struggling to answer a question about marriage or divorce or cohabitation, you can always throw in this idea about family diversity, i.e. the fact that there is now less stigma attached to certain types of families in society, such as lone parent families or reconstituted families, because they are so much more common and because people are less religious. Therefore, it doesn't mean that marriage is not important, it just means we're all now able to choose the type of family that we want to be a part of. It kind of assumes that in the past, all of the married nuclear couples weren't necessarily in the relationship because they wanted to be. They were in that relationship or marriage because they felt that that is what was socially acceptable. We then critique that through the use of functionalists, who are always going to take that rose-tinted, old-fashioned view about the nuclear family and marriage as being so fundamental for society to retain its value consensus, the norms, the values and the culture that keeps us going. Could have also applied the new right there as well, who are a right-wing political group who have had quite a lot of influence in family policy within government, who also see a married family as the best environment for children to grow up in. Therefore, they are also highly critical of family diversity and also agree that modern families do not value marriage in the same way that couples used to. In conclusion, although marriage rates may have decreased in society, this does not mean that marriage is no longer important. It may just mean that family life is changing in British society. So we're basically arguing here, just because something is different does not mean that it is not valued anymore. Actually, maybe lots of the couples who are cohabiting really do value marriage and do not want to end up getting divorced, which is why they are taking that extra time, care and attention before they walk down the aisle to make sure they are definitely with the person that they want to spend the rest of their life with. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe teaching within schools whereby students unknowingly learn the norms and values required for capitalism. Fill one circle only, 1 mark. A. Meritocracy. B. Hidden curriculum. C. Value consensus. D. National curriculum. You should only be spending around about 1 minute completing this question and just fully circling one answer. A reminder that if you circle more than one answer, then that will be void, even if one of your circles is for the correct answer. And do always remember that it is likely there will be 2 answers within the 4 that seem quite likely. So make sure you reread over those concepts again and again. So here we are looking for something within education where students are learning norms and values unknowingly. And that term unknowingly is really important in terms of us getting the correct answer. So if we just go through those key concepts we are given in A to D, A, meritocracy, which refers to the idea that education is an institution where students are rewarded based on their efforts and abilities. We've got B, hidden curriculum, the idea that there are some unwritten, unofficial lessons that are going on in school all the time. We've got C, value consensus, which is associated with the functionalist idea that society is built upon a shared set of norms and values. And then we've got the national curriculum, introduced after the 1988 Education Reform Act, meaning that there are some programs of study that all students should have access to within education. So here clearly, the correct answer is the hidden curriculum because it refers to students unknowingly learning the norms and values, whereas something like value consensus or the national curriculum is going on around students much more knowingly and they have much more awareness of. Identify the term commonly used by sociologists to describe work-related qualifications and training for students. Fill 1 circle only, 1 mark. So just spending around about 1 minute reading and answering this question and ensuring that we only circle one of the answers, because any more than that and the answer will be void. Our options are private schools, home education, vocational education, and deschooling. And the correct answer that you should have circled for this one is vocational education. And as mentioned in the question, this type of education refers to students moving away from a traditional academic learning approach to gaining hands-on experience in a variety of different workplaces, such as engineering or accountancy. And if we have a look at the other options then, A, private schools. So these are independent schools that are supported by the payment of fees by parents, generally associated with the middle class within sociology, however, do sometimes offer scholarships to working class students, tend to be advantageous in terms of having smaller class sizes and more one-to-one support for students. Home education refers to when a parent or guardian chooses not to send their child to school, but assumes responsibility for that child's education on a full-time basis. That may be through tutors visiting the home, that may be through online learning. Home education since COVID has actually increased massively with high numbers of students not returning to the classroom. And then you've also got deschooling, which is really a philosophical way of thinking about education, promoting the freedom of children to choose what they want to learn. So it's a child-led approach to learning. And so I think this question really just highlights how important it is going into the exam that you know the definition of a variety of different ways that students can learn. It's also really good when you understand the different ways that students can learn to get some knowledge of which social classes are more likely to be associated with which type of school. So we've already discussed that the private schools tend to attract more middle-class students just because of the fee-paying element, and that would be a really good example to use in an essay regarding meritocracy and the idea of fairness within education in the UK, which some sociologists would argue does not exist when we have some students selecting fee-paying schools that others cannot access. Describe one example of marketisation policy in education. 3 marks. So we should not be spending more than around about 3 to 4 minutes answering this question in the exam, and all 3 marks awarded will be AO1. So that means AQA are assessing whether you can provide a logical description with accurate sociological knowledge, and you are going to demonstrate that sociological knowledge through the use of key theories where appropriate, key terminology where appropriate, using contemporary examples, and in some questions also applying research methods. This specific question is asking us about one of the most important policies within education in the last 50 years, which is marketisation policy. And my top tip would be that if a question comes up on the exam on social policy in education, it is very likely that you will have to answer in some way about marketisation policy. And that is just because since the 1980s, this has been the driving force behind educational policy. And many of even the most contemporary policies that we have in education today have roots within marketisation ideas. So, what is marketisation? Why was it introduced? It refers to this trend in education led very much by the New Right, so a right-wing political group, and Margaret Thatcher, whereby there was an ideology that schools needed to become more competitive. And if schools are competitive and run like private businesses, the logic was that schools will raise their standards and become better for all students. So examples of marketisation policy in education would be something like the introduction of league tables, whereby schools have to publish their results and parents can access where those schools fall in a league table and compare schools between local areas. You've also got the introduction of free schools, which are more freely run away from local education authority control. You've got parents and business owners having much more of a say in those schools, and some of those schools therefore adhering to something like religious values. And the real controversy with marketisation policy, which as mentioned has continued since the 1980s within our education system, is who does it really benefit? So some sociologists like the New Right would argue marketisation policy within a meritocratic education system benefits all students because all schools have to compete and raise their standards, whereas other sociologists may argue that marketisation policy has only had a really positive impact on certain types of students, i.e. the middle class, and that is because their parents are more able to become more involved in how schools are run, but also have more cultural capital in terms of understanding things like league tables and Ofsted reports. This question is asking us just to provide an example. So if we have a look at a top-band answer, we will run through a few of the possible ideas you could have given. Describe one example of marketisation policy in education, 3 marks. One example of marketisation policy in education is the introduction of league tables. This means schools' data and performance is shared publicly so that parents can compare schools and make more informed decisions about school places. So you can see with regards to structure on this one, we make it as easy for the examiner as possible by using that little phrase, one example of, at the start of the sentence to show we are providing a specific example. Here we use the example of league tables, which as discussed were introduced after the Education Reform Act as a way to make schools very quickly need to compete against each other because now parents can see the performance of all the schools in their local area. We then just add some more knowledge in that second sentence to help us get those extra couple of marks by showing the examiner we understand the significance of league tables and we also understand the impact that this may have had on parents and school places, which have become increasingly competitive in some areas. Other examples that we could have given of marketisation policy in education include the introduction and expansion of academies and free schools, also giving parents access to more choice in the type of school their child attends, and giving that school themselves more choice with things like the national curriculum. Or we could have gone with the example of open enrolment, which means that schools can now be a bit more selective with regards to the students that they recruit outside of their local catchment area, which may be another way that schools actively try to encourage more middle-class students to attend rather than working-class students who ultimately end up more disadvantaged. Identify and describe one consequence cultural attitudes may have on educational attainment, 3 marks. So another question that we will be spending just 3 to 4 minutes answering in the exam, and you have only AO1 marks available here. So all 3 marks will be given depending on the description that you are able to provide and whether that shows enough accurate sociological knowledge, using theories where appropriate, using key terminology or concepts where appropriate, and supporting that where you can with contemporary examples and research methods if that is needed. And in terms of structuring your answer, you should very clearly show the examiner in your first sentence the consequence that you are identifying, and then you add your sentence or two of description to support that consequence. The term consequence within a sociology exam really just refers to the impact that something may have on something else. So here we are really talking about the impact cultural attitudes may have on educational attainment or achievement. And that might be that those cultural attitudes are leading to higher levels of educational attainment, or it could be that they are leading to lower levels of educational attainment. It might mean that it is leading to differences in educational attainment between genders or between ethnicities. But whichever idea we decide to go within the exam, we do need to ensure that we understand that term cultural attitudes, which basically refer to differences within a home background, potentially due to something like ethnicity. And that may be a consequence of something like parental control or expectations, or the value that parents place on education. And the alternative that we might get in the exam to cultural attitudes could be something like material deprivation, where we are now considering the material factors that may cause a student to over or underachieve in education, i.e., do you have a healthy diet? Do you have somewhere effective at home to be able to complete homework? With that in mind, though, let's have a look at a 3 out of 3 answer. Identify and describe one consequence cultural attitudes may have on educational attainment. 3 marks. One consequence cultural attitudes may have on educational attainment is students not performing as well as others in school. For example, working class parents may be less likely to show interest in their child's homework or school attainment, as they may have experienced less of a formal education themselves as compared to middle class parents. And you can see, to ensure we get the 3 out of 3, we have highlighted our consequence straight away, i.e. students not performing as well. And here we go with the different cultural attitudes between social classes. And it's that classic argument we come back to all the time in this education topic. Why are the working class underperforming compared to the middle class? Is it because of the cultural attitudes of the middle class parents, i.e. they show much more interest within their child's education because they are more likely to have gone to university themselves, compared to a working class parent who may actually still have quite a negative idea about education? And we could have used the example of Indian and Chinese students who tend to overachieve within education compared to other ethnic groups. And we may argue that that is again a consequence of the cultural attitudes of their parents, as several studies suggest that they do place a much higher value on education in the UK, and therefore they encourage children to complete homework and to work hard in school. Particularly within Indian culture, there tends to be more extended families, just to use some of our synoptic knowledge from families and households, and potentially having more adults in a household who are also more encouraging when it comes to education leads to these different attitudes that Indian students take to their learning than, for example, white working class boys. Item C. Halsey, Heath and Ridge completed a large-scale study with a sample size of 8,000. Completing face-to-face surveys with men, they investigated the relationship between life chances and social class. Dividing the sample into 3 social classes, their findings suggested that there was a strong correlation between the social class of an individual, based on their father's occupation, and the amount of time spent in further education. Source: Halsey, Heath and Ridge, Origins and Destinations, 1980. From item C, identify a weakness of the research, 2 marks. So you will just be spending a couple of minutes reading item C and forming a sentence or 2 as an answer for this one. And there are only AO 3 marks available, and that is because you should be applying your skills of evaluation, i.e. for this question, identifying a weakness of the research, critiquing the research that Halsey, Heath and Ridge have completed. And normally the weaknesses will be within item C. It's just a case of you reading through item C, interpreting that weakness, and then adding a little bit of description, outlining why that is a weakness of the research. You might also find within the item that there are 2 or 3 different ideas, so you just go with the one that you are confident about explaining, using hopefully some really nice conceptual research methods terminology. And here we have got one of your key studies in education, Halsey, Heath and Ridge, who basically researched and found out that social class was a really important factor in understanding or determining how long students remained in education. i.e., the working class lads within their study tended to leave school much earlier than the middle class lads. And before we consider the weaknesses of the research, it actually is a fantastic study to use in lots of questions where you are having to consider how far an impact social class has on one's educational attainment. It was a very large sample used of 8,000 men, and that sample was broken down into 3 different categories, which means you've got really great insight into the life chances of several different groups of students. However, there definitely are weaknesses we could address within this research study. The most obvious one being that we are only discussing men. So it lacks complete representativeness with regards to female attainment and female life chances. The fact that face-to-face surveys were used means that the participants were not able to fully expand on their answers in detail. Therefore, we might argue it actually lacks validity. And then also with regards to the sample of the 3 social classes, that was based on the definitions of Halsey, Heath and Ridge, which is potentially a very subjective idea about social class and could alter or change from sociologist to sociologist. So now we've got some ideas from the item, let's have a look at what a 2 out of 2 answer looks like. From item C, identify a weakness of the research, 2 marks. One weakness of the research is that the sample included only men. This means that any conclusions or generalisations reached will not be representative of female experiences relating to class and education. So a really classic criticism of this study that we are only hearing about the experiences or the life chances of male students, and it completely neglects the female experiences of social class and education. Makes the research totally unrepresentative from a female angle. And remember, when it comes to representativeness, we are arguing that your sample should mirror the target population and the characteristics within that population. And here we are only referring to males within education and completely neglecting a huge part of education made up of female students. And therefore we cannot apply the findings from this study to any females. We cannot assume that the father's occupation therefore has any impact on a female experience relating to how long they stay in school. Item C. Halsey, Heath and Ridge completed a large-scale study with a sample size of 8,000. Completing face-to-face surveys with men, they investigated the relationship between life chances and social class. Dividing the sample into 3 social classes, their findings suggested that there was a strong correlation between the social class of an individual based on their father's occupation and the amount of time spent in further education. Source, Halsey, Heath and Ridge, Origins and Destinations 1980. Identify and explain one factor that may have led to the lower educational attainment of working class boys referred to in item C, 4 marks. So we should only be spending around about 4 minutes answering this question and reading item C. And in terms of the marks, you can be awarded 1 mark for AO1, i.e. you identify a suitable factor. And then 3 marks may be awarded on top of that for AO2, which is your analysis and application of that factor. So can you provide key theories, concepts, examples to support the factor that you have given? And in the case of this question, we are referring back to that study by Halsey, Heath and Ridge, whereby completing a very extensive number of face-to-face surveys, they concluded that the social class of an individual based on their father's job did have a big impact on whether that individual stayed on in education or whether they dropped out at the earliest opportunity. And we know this is also supported by other sociological studies and official statistics within education that do show consistently working class boys are one of the lowest achievers within the education system. And this is supported by official statistics and data. In 2019, pre-COVID, white working class boys, i.e. those in receipt of free school meals, were underperforming the most compared to all other groups. So this question is asking us to explain that underachievement of working class boys, and there are an awful lot of explanations that you could give. You could decide to go down the gender route and explain why boys underperform compared to girls, or you could decide to go down the class route and explain why the working class tend to underperform compared to the middle class. And there are a few different ways we can approach this. You could talk about cultural factors that may lead to working class boys underperforming, or you could talk about material factors that may lead to working class boys underperforming. You may want to discuss internal factors, i.e. things that go on within the school building that lead to working class boys underperforming, or you might want to discuss external factors, so those things that go on outside of the school gates. Whichever one you pick, just make sure you can apply some great sociology to. Let's have a look at a 4 out of 4 answer. Identify and explain one factor that may have led to the lower educational attainment of working class boys referred to in item C. 4 marks. One factor that may have led to the lower educational achievement of working class boys as referred to in item C is material deprivation as a consequence of lower social class status. This refers to the fact that many working class boys may experience poorer living conditions than middle class boys. This means that these boys may live in overcrowded houses where they don't have a quiet, dedicated space to complete homework or revision. So within this answer, we have identified our factor to get our 1 AO1 mark as material deprivation. And just to remind you, whenever we discuss this concept in sociology, we are referring to the inability to afford basic resources. So within school, that might be not being able to afford things like educational resources or school trips. And once we've identified this factor to achieve our AO2 marks, we just explain the significance of this material deprivation, i.e. the fact that lower social class students, such as working class boys, live in potentially overcrowded, poorer housing conditions, which means that when they go home after a long school day, they don't have a quiet space to be able to sit and do their revision or their homework. Instead, they may be sharing a room with their sibling, or they may not have something like internet aiding their ability to be able to complete good, high-quality work. With regards to material deprivation and having those educational resources at home, it's always really good to keep COVID in the front of our minds because that did have such an impact on working class students who did not have effective spaces at home to complete home learning that was set from schools, further widening the gap between middle class and working class students. So it's just a really fantastic example to use in the exam where possible. Other examples of material deprivation, though, that we may refer to could even be something like the working class boys having a poorer diet compared to middle class boys. And we know that is much more likely to lead to higher absenteeism. So those boys are missing out on vital learning taking place in the classroom compared to middle class students. If we had wanted to come at this as more of a gender-based answer, then we could have argued that it is an internal factor within schools, i.e. teacher labelling, that leads to working class boy underachievement because teachers tend to favour female learners who they see as being more quiet and submissive and see working class boys as being rowdy and boisterous. And that negative label, as we know, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, i.e. boys start living up to that status because they internalise the labels that they are given. Identify and explain one disadvantage of using participant observation to investigate anti-school subcultures, 4 marks. So you are going to spend around about 4 minutes answering this question, and with regards to the breakdown of the marks, you can receive 1 mark for your AO1 knowledge. That refers to the disadvantage that you identify. And then you can get a further 3 marks of AO2, which for this question means explaining that disadvantage using terminology and concepts associated with research methods, but then also being able to put that in the context of the specific educational study here, which is anti-school subcultures. So whilst the disadvantage that we provide can be a general research methods disadvantage relating to participant observation, you do need to try and avoid just writing generally in terms of your explanation of that disadvantage, and to fully explain why that would be so much of a problem in the study of anti-school subcultures. I therefore would recommend, in terms of structure, very clearly outlining your disadvantage to the examiner, adding a sentence to support that disadvantage, and then applying it to anti-school subcultures. And just with regards to the research method you have been given here, participant observation is a type of method associated with interpretivist sociology. So that means that we are going to obtain qualitative data, and the researcher is going to immerse themselves in a particular group or social setting that they are trying to observe. Therefore, within this question, the researcher will be immersing themselves within some form of anti-school subcultures. And just to remind you on that key term, anti-school subcultures or counter-school subcultures, as they're sometimes known, are basically groups of students who go against the values, the norms, or the rules of a particular school. So examples may include students who refuse to wear the school uniform, who have negative attitudes towards teachers, or who try to bunk off school as often as they can. So straight away, before we've even gone into some of the general disadvantages of using participant observation, you may already be able to consider some of the reasons why these specific groups in schools are going to be quite difficult to observe. For one, they are going to have a negative attitude towards adults, i.e. teachers, and therefore a sociologist entering that environment, trying to observe them, is probably going to experience quite a lot of hostility. Therefore, that is going to mean data collected is not valid because students are acting in a way that they would not normally act. We also call this the Hawthorne effect, whereby when people know they are being watched, they change their behaviour. And finally, before we look at a 4 out of 4 answer, just wanted to remind you how important it is to think about your PhET when completing any sort of research methods question. By that I mean the practical, ethical, and theoretical disadvantages that we may be able to provide, or in an alternative question, advantages. So practical, referring to how you are going to gain access to the group, how much it's going to cost you, how much time you will need to spend there. Ethical, referring to ensuring that all participants and the researcher leave the project unharmed and that you adhere to confidentiality. And with regards to theory, whether an interpretivist or a positivist would support your choice of research method based on some of that lovely key terminology such as generalizations, validity, reliability, representativeness. So let's have a look at a 4 out of 4 answer. Identify and explain one disadvantage of using participant observation to investigate anti-school subcultures, 4 marks. One disadvantage of using participant observation to investigate anti-school subcultures is that their participants are likely to change their behaviour as they know they are being observed, which means the results obtained will lack validity. This is referred to as the Hawthorne effect and will be particularly likely to happen when observing these groups, as they may not want to be observed engaging in behaviour that will result in them receiving punishment within school. So, in that first sentence, we have clearly identified to the examiner our disadvantage, i.e. participants will change their behaviour. Therefore, we have achieved our AO1, 1 mark out of 4. We then move on to our AO2 marks, and here we identify the sociological term associated with participants changing their behaviour, which is the Hawthorne effect, noted primarily within laboratory experiments, but is also useful to use whenever a question comes up regarding non-participant or participant observation. And then finally, we put that in the context of anti-school subcultures to make sure we get our 4 out of 4. And if we think about anti-school subcultures, i.e. groups that go against the norms, the values and the culture of the school, it is very likely that when you are observing them, you are going to observe them taking part in behaviour that you might feel you need to tell the school about. Therefore, these groups will know this, they will see you as an outsider. Possibly if you are middle-aged and look a little bit like a teacher within their school, they are going to just associate you with groups in society that they are hostile to. And therefore, they will either decide to just act differently while the participant observation is going on. They might even play up to their image of being an anti-school subculture, maybe due to labelling and internalising those labels, or they might just refuse to take part in your research altogether. Other types of disadvantages we could have referred to for this question include the practical disadvantage of having to actually gain access to anti-school subcultures. It is unlikely if you go into a school that a head teacher is going to point out to you who the anti-school subcultures are, but it's also very unlikely that the anti-school subcultures are going to make themselves known to you. So it might be that you have to get into the school environment and then figure that out for yourself. And the recording of data whilst conducting any sort of participant observation is a challenge, but particularly with anti-school subcultures, as a lot of the observation that you want to record might be taking place out on the playground. Item D. Sociologists Ball, Bow and Gerwitz are interested in understanding the impact marketisation policy is having on education in the UK. These educational policies were originally introduced to create more competition between schools and to give parents increased choice over their child's schooling. Using a sample of 15 secondary schools and completing interviews, analysing secondary data and attending staff meetings, they concluded that middle-class children benefited the most from these changes as their parents took advantage of the system. Source: Ball, Bow and Gerwitz, Market Forces, Parental Choice and Competition Between Schools, 1994. From item D, identify and describe the research method used by Ball, Bow and Gerwitz, including what you know of their perspective on education. 4 marks. So you should spend around about 4 to 5 minutes completing that question, which does include time for you to be able to read the item as well. And I really would recommend reading the item carefully on these type of 4-mark questions, because part of the answer that you need to give the examiner is actually just within the item. And you should be familiar with the sociologist within the item on these types of questions, because it will come from one of your key studies. So that could include Ball, that could include Bowles and Gintis, Durkheim, Halsey, Heath and Ridge, Parsons, or Willis's study. And with regards to how you are going to achieve your 4 marks on this question, you can get a maximum of 1 AO1 marks, and that is achieved by identifying the research method correctly. And then you can achieve 3 AO2 marks, which is where you apply key terminology, concepts, examples, and knowledge of how they researched education and what they concluded. And with regards to this specific question, you are looking at Ball, Bow and Gerwitz study of market forces and parental choice. Just to remind you, the study was evaluating the impact of parental choice after changes in educational policy such as marketisation. So they focus a lot on the introduction of league tables and how this then changed the attitudes of some schools who were now competing to gain students like customers. And you can see in the second part of that item, you do have some information about how they completed their research, using a sample of 15 secondary schools and completing interviews, secondary data, and attending staff meetings. So the structure of your answer should definitely be identifying the method used, applying a bit more information about that method, and then adding a sentence or 2 about their study. And just to remind you, there are no AO3 marks available for this answer. So that means there is no need for you to provide either positive or negative evaluation regarding their study. For example, you might find the sample of 15 secondary schools quite limiting in terms of being able to provide a representative sample of the whole of the UK, but that is not required in your answer. You are literally just providing that analysis of their study. From item D, identify and describe the research method used by Ball, Bow and Gerwitz, including what you know of their perspective on education. 4 marks. The research method used was completing interviews and studying secondary data in 15 schools and 3 local education authorities, focusing on the effects marketisation and increased competition was having on the education system. Through their study, they concluded that policies such as the introduction of league tables were actually making schools more unequal and widening the gap between working class and middle class students, as some schools were actively recruiting more gifted and talented students. So you can clearly see in the first sentence, we identify the research methods used by Ball, Bow and Gerwitz, and that means we can achieve that AO1 mark really easily and quickly. And we then go on to discuss some of the conclusions within their research. We know we are studying this in the context of marketisation policy, whereby schools became more competitive and more business-like, and therefore Ball, Bow and Gerwitz really conclude that actually in trying to raise the standards of education through competition, what actually happened was some schools were able to actively recruit students that they felt would help them to rise in the league tables rather than helping the less able students, which ultimately leads to a gap between the working class and middle class, because we know that middle class students are more likely to fall into that category of what schools consider to be an ideal pupil. We could have also discussed streaming and the effects that that may have had as a consequence of marketisation. So Ball, Bow and Gerwitz also find that less able students were neglected within some schools than more able students, as these students were seen as commodities and they had less value to offer the school in this new competitive marketplace. So as a consequence of that, streaming may have been introduced to ensure that the middle class top ability students were able to be educated separately from less able students. Overall, Ball, Bow and Gerwitz's study is clearly quite controversial when it comes to the effects of marketisation and is a fantastic example to use if you ever get a question about social class inequalities within education or the effects of recent social policies. I must just say, if we did get this in another type of question and we needed to provide evaluation of Ball, Bow and Gerwitz, we would obviously refer to the measures that lots of schools have in place to ensure that less able students and working class students can achieve. An example of that would be pupil premium funding that is now available to schools, whereby state schools get extra grant funding to improve the educational outcomes of the disadvantaged pupils that Ball, Bow and Gerwitz argue are falling behind within mainstream education. Identify and explain one possible advantage of using official statistics to investigate the differences between independent and state schools. 4 marks. So you are going to spend around about 4 minutes completing this question, and you will be awarded 1 AO1 mark, whereby you identify the advantage of using official statistics, and then a further 3 AO2 marks for applying knowledge, key terminology, examples, and potentially some knowledge of research methods. And then finally, with this one, we do also need to see somewhere you have been able to apply this to the specific context given. And the specific context given here is the differences between independent and state schools. Just to make sure that we fully understand the difference between these two types of schools, most commonly, independent schools are referred to as private schools. So that means they are selective and normally parents are paying fees to the school. They quite often set their own curriculum as well. Whereas state schools refer to government-funded schools, which provide education for all students free of charge. Some of the differences that we might see between the two schools, well, obviously, because of the paid element of independent schooling, quite often the size of the class will be smaller, so teachers might be able to focus more on the pupil. There may be better facilities as parents are paying fees, so the school's budget may be higher. And as mentioned, they don't have to follow any sort of official or national curriculum. However, this is obviously criticised within sociology because some see this as just perpetuating inequality between working class and middle class students. As a result of attending independent or private schools, it might be that that child has a better chance of getting into the best university, getting the best job later on in life. And obviously all of this would feed into something like a Marxist perspective, where we are saying that actually this is just reinforcing the status quo or the hierarchy of those in power, i.e. the ruling class. For the purpose of this question, though, we really just want to know, why would it be a benefit to use official statistics to try and understand more about the differences students experience between these two different types of schooling? So we can use our general advantages of official statistics from that positivist perspective that you are going to achieve some lovely quantitative data. However, we do just need to try and link that to why that will be useful when considering independent and state schools. So with that in mind, let's have a look at a 4 out of 4 answer. Identify and explain one possible advantage of using official statistics to investigate the differences between independent and state schools. 4 marks. One practical advantage of using official statistics to consider differences between independent and state schools is that schools must publish this data every year, and therefore these statistics are widely available for sociologists to view for free online. This also often includes data on demographic characteristics such as gender and ethnicity. This means that the researcher can quickly and cheaply gain access to several years of official statistics to make comparisons and spot trends over time without having to make contact with schools themselves. So there are absolutely loads of benefits of using official statistics to study these differences. Here we have focused on one of the practical benefits of using these types of statistics, and that is just because schools, whether independent or state, have to provide these statistics every single year, have to put them either on their website or direct where people can find these statistics, and therefore from a sociological perspective, it is an extremely practical, quick and cheap way to study some of the kinds of differences between these two types of schools. And then we go on to mention some of the types of differences that we might actually consider. Here we discuss things like gender and ethnicity. So are there certain genders that are performing better in independent or state schools? Are there certain types of ethnic groups who are more likely to attend one of these types of schools? And again, we just justify why that is so brilliantly practical for sociologists, because it means you can spot trends over a very long period of time, because we have these statistics going back several years without having to actually make contact with the schools themselves, which again would be very tricky and pose lots of practical problems. For example, schools will be reluctant to have a sociologist on site, particularly if there is a potential that that sociologist is going to discover something about the school that could reflect on it negatively. Other advantages that we could have provided from a positivist perspective is the fact that the researcher is very detached from the use of official statistics. So that might mean that the researcher has no influence on the data obtained, and therefore we are gaining an objective analysis of independent and state schooling. And that's quite important for a topic like this, where people may have lots of assumptions and ideas about differences going into the research. Just please finally note the use of that phrase, "this means that," which we try to use as much as possible within sociology answers, because it shows the examiner that we are providing some lovely AO2 knowledge. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that marketisation policy in the last 30 years has had only positive effects on education. 12 marks. So as a reminder, you should allow around about 12 or 13 minutes when completing this answer. And these 12-mark questions are the only ones on the AQA GCSE Sociology paper where you need to form a full essay answer. So I would recommend structuring this with a short introduction where you define key terms or lay out your argument, and then 2 very chunky, peely paragraphs: point, evidence, explain, link, and evaluation, that cover both sides of the argument that you are given within the inquiry question. And then finally, a short conclusion where you reach a decision. And some students do find it a little tricky to write chunky sociological paragraphs. So if that is you, then it is absolutely fine to break your paragraphs up into 2 or 3 sections. Just make sure that you evaluate both of the points that you give on each side of the argument, because if you don't do that, you are going to struggle getting into the top band of 10 to 12 marks. And with regards to the marks on this question, you can achieve 4 marks for AO1. That refers to showing excellent knowledge and explanation of theories, concepts, examples. You can achieve 4 marks for AO2, and that is your ability to apply these theories or this key terminology and examples to the specifics within the question. And then, as mentioned, 4 marks for excellent criticism of the theories. So you evaluate the theories that you discuss on both sides of the argument. And when we are reaching conclusions throughout this essay, it is very important that we try and avoid our personal opinions. We need to make sure any conclusions that we draw are actually based upon sociological theory or studies or specific evidence that we can produce. And very often in these types of 12 markers, there will be a variety of different points that you can include in your answer. There is no just one right or wrong, and therefore you just need to take some time when you read the question, perhaps produce a very short plan and decide which knowledge does actually focus on the question that's being asked, but also which knowledge is going to best show off your sociological skills. And if we have a look at the specific question that we've got here, there are clearly 2 sides of an argument. Argument number 1 being that marketisation policy in education has been a really positive thing for students. The other side of the argument being that marketisation policy in education has not had a positive effect for all students. So just to remind you of some of the key knowledge within this question then, marketisation policy refers to a period in the 1980s when the new right had influence over educational policy, particularly within Thatcher's government, and also includes the 1988 Education Reform Act. And a part of this Reform Act meant that schools were encouraged to raise standards through competition. So schools are acting more like private businesses through marketisation. They are less under the control of local education authorities. And alongside that is the publication of league tables that mean parents can see where exactly schools are performing well, but also where schools are underperforming, and can have more of a say, therefore, on where they want their children to go to school. So in this sense, schools start acting as businesses and students become consumers. There's lots of debate regarding marketisation. It is still a policy that has continued within education. And one of the main arguments is which type of student has benefited from it the most. Many sociologists argue that marketisation policy has been a fantastic thing for the middle class, but they were already doing really well in education. And actually what's happened is the working class, who were already struggling in education, are now performing even worse. So that's our knowledge. That's a very brief summary of the 2 sides of our argument. Let's have a look at a practice answer. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that marketisation policy in the last 30 years has had only positive effects on education. 12 marks. Marketisation policy was introduced in education following the 1988 Education Reform Act. The purpose was to raise the standards of education. However, some argue it has only benefited certain students. So in that very brief introduction, we do everything we need to. First of all, we show the examiner we understand the context of marketisation policy with regards to the law that introduced it. We then discuss why it was introduced. And finally, we start to lay out some argument. Absolutely no need to do any more than that in an introduction, because you will struggle to pick up lots of AO1, AO2 and AO3 marks. Let's have a look at our first paragraph. Some sociologists, such as the new right, argue that marketisation has had a very positive impact on the standards of education, as stated in the question. This is because they argue that any policies to make schools more competitive ultimately improve the outcomes of students. This is because league tables, introduced as part of the 1988 Education Reform Act, mean schools must compete to attract students as customers, and parents can choose the type of school that they feel is best for their child. There are also more variety of schools available to choose from, including academies and free schools, making schools fairer. However, some sociologists critique these policies, arguing that schools are not meritocratic as a consequence of marketisation policy, as there continues to be wide gaps between gender and social class, with white working class boys underperforming significantly. So what we do at the start of this paragraph is identify the sociological theorists who would agree with the question. And I would always suggest starting your essay with the side of the argument that is in agreement with the question. Just reads much nicer for the examiner, and it shows that you are absolutely focused on the question that you are answering. We then use specific examples of marketisation policy to support what we are saying. So where we discuss the raising of standards of education or making schools more competitive, we give solid examples of how marketisation may do that, i.e. this idea of league tables and students becoming customers. Note how we also include several examples and ideas within one paragraph to ensure that we get our AO2 marks. So we don't just talk about the new right, we also explain the purpose of league tables, and then we also go on to talk about other types of marketisation policy, including academies and free schools. And just to remind you of that term free school, it is a type of academy in the UK that has moved away from local education authority control. They are non-profit making and you do not have to pay fees to attend, but they are quite often associated with either a business or a charitable trust, and parents ultimately have much more say in how that school is run. And then we signpost to the examiner that we are applying our AO3 skills now with critique through the word however, and argue that some sociologists do not feel that marketisation policy has improved standards for education for everyone, and that actually what it has done is widen the gap between those who are doing well in education and those who are not. We also use that key term meritocratic here, which refers to an education system whereby everyone is able to achieve the best grades based on only their ability and hard work. And unfortunately, there is a lot of statistical evidence in sociology within education that proves this is not correct. For example, white working class boys are consistently found at the bottom end of attainment when it comes to achieving a grade 5 or above in English and maths compared to all other groups. And this therefore proves that marketisation policy, which is supposed to make schools more competitive and raise the standards of schools for everyone, has not worked. Another way we could critique this new right view and the view that marketisation has raised standards within education would be to consider the role that middle class parents can play in these academies and free schools compared to working class parents. There is a term called parentocracy, which refers to the idea that middle class parents benefit the most from marketisation because they have the cultural capital, i.e. the knowledge and the skills of the education system, to make sure that they can interpret Ofsted reports, to make sure that they can move to the area where the school is performing the best for their student, which again proves marketisation does not act in the interest of all students as suggested in the question. Let's have a look at the second paragraph. We are now creating our other side of the argument to say that marketisation policy has not had positive effects on education. Other sociologists such as Boulder and Gurwitz argue that schools now benefit middle-class students more than working-class students as a consequence of marketisation policies that have failed. They argue that this gives some schools the ability to select bright students over the less able, which widens educational inequality. Others support this and argue this has also led to the rise of parentocracy, which means that through more choice, middle-class parents have become privileged, skilled choosers, widening the gap between classes in education. However, there have been a number of policies to try and tackle this divide, such as pupil premium funding to support lower income students. So here we do bring in some of that knowledge that we were just discussing to create the other side of the argument using one of our key studies, Boulder and Gurwitz, who really do argue that it is only the best performing schools and middle class students who have gained anything from marketisation policy. And according to Boulder and Gerwitz in their study looking at a variety of schools following the introduction of marketisation, they concluded that actually the introduction of league tables and the way that this impacted the funding given to a school meant that many schools were having to carefully select the best, most able students, which ultimately left the less able students even more disadvantaged than they were previously. And this approach used by these schools is known as cream skimming or silt shifting, to really just try and make sure the best pupils get through their school gates. And then we go on to support this further through how this actually benefits middle class parents more than working class parents, because middle class parents, as discussed previously, have the knowledge to know how to play the system. They understand maybe renting a property near to the best school in order to get their child into that school, or maybe they understand about how to get tutors for their students in order to take entrance exams and get into the best school locally. We then actually critique this view using some very contemporary social policy within education called pupil premium funding. And this funding takes the form of a grant that is given to schools based on the number of pupil premium students they have on roll, and that money should in theory be spent to try and ensure that student is able to obtain the same resources as a middle class student or is able to access extra tuition. However, you could also criticise that theory, as schools are not given a clearly defined way that they need to spend the money, and therefore that can vary massively from school to school. Overall, marketisation has provided parents with more choice, but this has ultimately benefited middle class students who were already outperforming the working class. So in our conclusion then, we do answer the question. We talk about the fact that marketisation policy has been positive and successful for some students, but that has been at the cost of working class students who are now underperforming even more. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that teacher labelling has the biggest impact on student performance in education, 12 marks. So you are going to spend around about 12 or 13 minutes constructing a short sociological essay to answer this question. You do need to include a short introduction and conclusion, and then also ensure that you provide analysis on both sides of the argument. So for this question, that will be a paragraph or several short paragraphs regarding how teacher labelling definitely does have the biggest impact on student performance. Maybe it encourages students to perform really well. Maybe it has a detrimental impact on student performance. Maybe it impacts some students more than others. And then for this question, the other side of the argument is likely to be you bringing in another factor that you think has an even bigger impact on student performance in education. So you're not just going to evaluate the view that teacher labelling has the biggest impact. You are going to need to introduce another idea that has a greater impact in order to get into that top band. And the kind of ideas that you might include are material deprivation, cultural differences, or maybe even government policy with regards to student performance. And a reminder on how the mark scheme is structured. You can achieve 4 marks for AO1. That is your excellent knowledge and explanation of theories, of concepts and examples. You can achieve 4 marks for your AO2. That is your ability to apply these theories and these concepts and these examples to the specific question of teacher labelling and student performance. And then 4 marks for your AO3, i.e. your criticisms. So ensuring that at the end of each of your points or the end of each of your paragraphs, you provide some evaluation. So you specifically address the point that you have made and you prove why this point might not be relevant for the whole population of students. It might be that the theory is deterministic. It might be that the theory is outdated. Certainly, though, you need to know about teacher labelling theory to be able to get top marks on this question. And this theory is associated with Becker. Becker is an interactionist sociologist. And just to remind you, that means that these types of sociologists really focus on conversations and interactions that go on all the time on a daily basis as being very, very significant on someone's life. rather than our other types of theorists, like structural theorists, who argue that it is the big structures at the top of society, like religion, like education, like the family, that impact how we behave and ultimately affect our life chances. So by taking an interactionist perspective, we are arguing then that teacher judgments within schools and teacher conversations within school can have a really, really either positive or negative impact on student performance. It might be that you are viewed as an ideal pupil by the teacher and therefore you are praised and that praise is internalised, and as a consequence of that you continue to work hard at school and achieve the best grades. Or maybe you're one of those students that is labelled as a class clown or a troublemaker, and therefore the negative interactions that you have on a daily basis with the teachers are also internalised and cause you to just give up and think, what is the point of school? With regards to the other side of the question here, then, we are going to need to bring in another factor that could be more significant than teacher labelling. And as teacher labelling is known as an internal factor, i.e. it is one of the things that goes on inside the school building that can have an impact on how we perform in exams, it makes most sense really to think about external factors, i.e. things that happen outside of school that impact our achievement within school. So that might be something like the support of your parents, that might be something like experiencing material deprivation and not being able to afford the resources that help you to get better grades in your exams. So let's have a look at what a top band answer would look like. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that teacher labelling has the biggest impact on student performance in education, 12 marks. Teacher labelling refers to teachers making stereotypical judgments about students on a daily basis. This may be negative and lead to students underperforming. So in our little introduction there, we show the examiner we understand what teacher labelling is, i.e. this stereotypical judgment. And then we also talk about the fact that this can definitely have an impact on students. Here we are discussing how it can negatively impact students. Now we need to consider our theorists on this side of the argument. Interactionists such as Becker argue that teacher judgments and conversations on a daily basis within the classroom can have the biggest effect on student outcomes. For example, if a student is negatively labelled by a teacher as a troublemaker, the teacher may use negative language with that student and lower their expectations, even placing the student in lower sets. The student may then internalise this negative label, which will become a self-fulfilling prophecy leading to further poor behaviour. Furthermore, the halo effect means teachers are more likely to positively label and encourage white middle-class girls, which may explain why boys are underachieving. However, interactionism assumes all students respond to labels given by teachers in the same way, which is deterministic. So, absolutely tons of lovely sociology in this paragraph. It's short, it's concise, but it does exactly what it needs to in terms of answering the question and in terms of hitting AO1, AO2 and AO3. First of all, we identify the most influential interactionist, i.e. Becker, and we explain how his theory may work within the classroom. I would always recommend when you are using labelling as an example in an exam, show the link between the teacher making the negative comments, the student over time internalising that negative comment, and then that becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, i.e. the student starts to act in the way that they feel others expect them to act. What we also do in this paragraph, though, is show how this doesn't have to be negative and can also be positive, and we use that lovely sociological concept, the halo effect. And this refers to that idea that some teachers may have an image of an ideal pupil in their mind, and therefore they already decide which students in their class are likely to achieve good grades and are likely to behave themselves, and therefore the teacher treats that student accordingly. We even use the example in this paragraph of how that could lead to students being put in different sets. And obviously, once a student has had a stereotypical label attached to them and been placed in a lower set, that means that their access to some learning resources are reduced from that very moment. Whereas the student that is placed in the higher set gets a status attached to that and therefore wants to work even harder in order to stay in the top set. We then also identify how labelling theory could be working in practice in schools because we know middle-class white girls are performing well in school, and we know that boys are underachieving, both middle-class and particularly working-class boys. Therefore, if teachers are more likely to label middle-class girls as being very submissive, passive, well-behaved and working really hard, that may explain why they are doing really well in their GCSEs and A-levels. We also then evaluate this theory, and the best way to evaluate interactionism in the exam is to argue that it is slightly deterministic, which means that they tend to assume that all students will respond to labels, whether they are positive or negative, in exactly the same way. And we could argue that actually students are powerful individuals who have the authority to reject labels if they want to. Structural theorists such as Marxists and feminists would also argue that interactionists ignore the impact of wider structural issues in society, i.e. for Marxists, capitalism and social class inequality, and for feminists, i.e. patriarchy and men having control over women. Let's have a look at our second paragraph then. We're now going to explain the other side of the argument and actually discuss another factor that may be a bigger impact on student performance rather than teacher labelling. Moreover, factors students experience outside of school may have more of an impact on educational outcomes rather than teacher labelling. Material deprivation, referring to a lack of basic and educational resources, means the working class students are less likely to be able to afford educational trips, high quality food, or have a quiet place to study at home. This means that regardless of teacher labelling, they are unable to keep up with middle-class students, as they may miss time off school or struggle to complete work. However, this ignores the policies the government have put into place to address this inequality, such as pupil premium funding. So essentially, here we are arguing that it is not internal factors such as labelling that has the biggest impact on student performance, but actually it is external factors, things that go on outside of the school gates that actually teachers have very little control of. And here we use the argument of material deprivation, i.e. some students lack the basic necessities needed in order to do well within education. They might not be able to afford the best types of food and therefore they have higher rates of absenteeism. They might live in overcrowded housing and therefore they don't have a quiet space to be able to complete their work. Or they might not be able to afford educational resources such as textbooks or the internet. And we also know that this problem of material deprivation has gotten worse since COVID, and particularly with the cost of living crisis, meaning that there is even bigger educational gaps between the middle class and the working class, which seem to support this material deprivation view. Other ideas we could have included here as a separate factor to teacher labelling that impacts student performance could have been counter-school subcultures. So Willis found in his study of working class boys that they deliberately formed gangs in order to reject the norms and values of education. They basically prepared themselves for a world of work in capitalist society. And therefore, regardless of teacher labelling, those boys had decided that they did not want to achieve in education. With regards to our evaluation here, we discussed the fact that the government has introduced policies in order to try and address material inequality, such as pupil premium funding, meaning that those disadvantaged should gain extra support from the school. We could, of course, also have argued in our evaluation that actually it is the cultural attitude of parents that can have a bigger impact than material deprivation. So, for example, there are plenty of working class families. Some working class Chinese families are a fantastic example of this, whereby parents place a very high value on education and they are actually overperforming. Let's have a look at our conclusion. Overall, it is clear that teacher labelling can have a detrimental or highly positive effect on students within the classroom. But we must also consider the other issues some students face, such as material deprivation. So a lovely little summary here, where we basically argue that yes, teacher labelling does have an impact on student performance, but actually student attainment and student underachievement is such a complex issue. And therefore, we need to consider a variety of different reasons as to explain why some students fail within the education system. And that is a really nice type of conclusion that you could include in lots of these 12 markers.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.